So thank you very much, everybody. Welcome to our mini summit here in Houston. I was kind of hoping that it would be a little bit more. Can we get a bigger summit next time, Tim? I'm putting them on the spot, right? No, this is awesome. You know, we did this a couple of years ago before COVID. It was an excellent time coming down here and speaking to people from Houston, from Texas, and getting that perspective from local people, and you know, just kind of interacting and bonding with them. But one of my favorite times and talking, especially at nights, which is kind of what I consider this. I consider this as an at night, even though it is kind of a summit environment. And why I enjoy that is I got a lot of audience participation, meaning that you know, people were asking questions as we were going. We were interacting. I see a lot of great head nods about things that they're agreeing with what I say. Kind of like, you know, it's easy to see the confused look when I'm not making sense. So I really enjoy the at night talks. And so please, you know, do interject. It's a little bit harder to do it with some of the online teams, but I don't mind fielding questions as we're going. You can save it to the end. That's fine. Or you can just raise your hand. We do need to do the microphone at the same time so that people can hear us online and they can interact with us as well and get that full experience. So I really appreciate it. Yes, we are doing tactical risk reduction in ICS environments. That's what we're going to talk about today. And I think this is important because we have a lot of information, especially in our control environments, especially being put out by our standards bodies that are helping us understand how to approach risk from a strategic standpoint. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to break that down for you. All right, because I do think there is a difference between risk assessments from a strategic level and doing vulnerability assessments and collecting tactical information so that we can make quick decisions to reduce risk, okay? That also feed into that risk management process that our leadership is looking to and going to be making decisions on. So let's talk about some of that. First of all, I mean, I don't really need to talk about myself too much. Tim did an excellent job. Thank you very much. We need to record that. You know, all right, that's awesome. I really appreciate it. Yes, I've been doing this for since about 2000, but I've actually been in the control environment looking at assets, especially around utilities, since about 2010, doing you know, going back and forth between defending environments and also doing security assessments, penetration testing. I've done a lot of security research as well. I teach the ICS 410 class. Also, I teach the hosted class, the assessing and exploiting class. I've done that a little bit. Justin does that a little bit more because I've been focusing on the new course. So really excited about all of that and some of the new things that are coming out. And we'll talk about at least one of those things today. Okay. So our agenda. First, we need to identify risk assessments. We need to talk about what the industry is doing. Now, I know that a lot of people, we've been kind of focused in on utilities right now, and they have NERC-CIP, but a lot of other industries are looking to 62443. They're looking to those international standards to understand what their security program should be and doing risk assessments. So I'm going to touch base on that. I'm going to use that to help set the groundwork around that, and then we're going to discuss strategic and tactical. And then from there, I'm going to make some recommendations, okay? And so we'll finish up with that. All right, so ICS risk assessments. If you're not familiar with the 62443 risk assessment process, if you haven't done their certification, gone through and done their certification around this, or if you haven't read their documentation, the 62443 series of standards is excellent from a security program standpoint. In other words, if you're not doing it, if your organization is not familiar with it, or if you need guidance on how to correctly implement it, you should look to that standard because they have put a lot of thought and a lot of effort into identifying what is required to do it successfully, to understand all of the different domains so that you can task people appropriately. And a part of the core, one of the core parts of that, which is outlined in their document, it's 62443 3-2. It's titled Security Risk Assessment for System Design. What this does is this outlines a risk assessment program. It tells you exactly what you need, the information you need to collect, how you need to approach your programs, gathering the information, working with your vendors and your integrators to gather that information, identifying threats, identifying vulnerabilities, looking at the consequences associated with actually the exploits. If something is exploited, what is the consequence and impact of that? Identifying those vulnerabilities, looking at the likelihood and so forth. You can see all of that, those bullet points outlined there for you. The 62443 outlines exactly what you're supposed to do to identify all of these things. It also goes into identifying security target levels, security levels, because you need to identify what your security target level is. How secure do you want to be? One of the issues that we have in any kind of control environment is we do not want to over design anything within our environment. In other words, we don't want to induce cost unnecessarily. So if we over engineer our security, then we're wasting money and we're wasting time and effort. So what they want you to do is they want you to evaluate your security target level, okay? Then you're going to evaluate your systems to see what your unmitigated risks are, so you can see what you've achieved. And then finally, you're going to look at your compensating controls, your countermeasures to address any gaps that's been identified. This is a whole risk assessment process, okay? This takes a combined effort between your security team, your OT team, your leadership, your vendors and integrators. It is a lot of detailed information. However, the core part of it, and one of the things that I didn't realize until I started working on the getting this certification, is I always thought that when I was doing a penetration test or a security assessment, I was doing a risk and vulnerability analysis, okay? And I was actually doing the risk assessment around that. And then I realized after I did this, that the part of the process that the security assessment is doing is actually just a vulnerability assessment. You know, and that it seems odd, because when we think about vulnerability assessment, we're like, oh, there's a vulnerability. We have a CVE score associated with that, and we just feed that into our system, and we decide to prioritize how we're going to address things. Okay, but no, our penetration tests are going to evaluate the implementation of our technologies. It's a vulnerability assessment for how we've deployed these systems. We're going to identify those vulnerabilities. We're going to rate them by looking at it objectively, looking at the consequences and so forth. And then we're going to provide information that's associated with the unmitigated risk at that time. And then we are going to pass that off to the risk team. And the risk team is going to take that information, identify what our countermeasures are to figure out or to address those issues. And then they will come up with our security level target score after they've implemented the countermeasures, okay? So security assessment is actually a vulnerability assessment, and we'll talk about that. We're just giving actionable information into a detailed risk assessment. Detailed risk assessment, if you look into the 62443, that's a very specific defined term that has that's associated with the process. All right, so when we're doing this risk assessment, and we're defining security levels, we have to take into consideration these 7 foundational requirements. We have to talk about identification and authentication control, use control, system integration, data confidentiality. I can read all the bullet points. There's 7 of them, right? And if you look at those, they make sense, okay? I mean, one of the most important things there is timely response to events. Okay, how fast, if something happens, how fast can our team address it, identify that, and address it and account for it? Okay, and those are important things to understand. Okay, but they want you to do this evaluation for every single asset, not just for an environment. Okay, if you have a server, they want to know your security, how your security level for every one of those foundational requirements for each asset. Okay. Now, if you go to your process engineers, do they really want to talk down to this level for every single asset? Not necessarily. Now, your risk team does. The risk team needs to understand this and evaluate this. But from a actual process level, they just want to know what to do, okay? They have questions. If you're going to be doing an assessment, how do I safely gather information about my process to understand how I'm achieving all of those foundational requirements? How do I safely do a pen test? What are these people going to be doing there? All right, you find a vulnerability. Now what do we do? Okay, they just want you to tell them how to reduce the risk because they want to get back to their jobs. They want to implement the security controls so that they're reducing the risk, so they're making things more reliable and more available. Okay, so we need to, I think, my personal opinion is we need to take a slightly different approach when we're collecting information in these environments. Because right now, when we're thinking about when we're thinking about approaches, okay, strategic is making strategic decisions that are having a systematic impact across our whole environment. But when we're doing a vulnerability assessment, we're looking at one single environment. We might be looking at one system. Typically, we're looking at system of systems that is a specific portion of our process. So we're actually gathering information so that we can make tactical decisions at that process level. Okay, so we need to be, from a vulnerability assessment standpoint, my job when I'm coming in to assist your team or any security professional that's coming in to help with a security assessment or a penetration test, they're gathering information to help you make a tactical decision. And that information is also feeding back into your risk assessment process so that you can make a strategic decision. Okay. So in order to understand this, we do need to understand the difference between some of the security assessment types. And I use this slide to help people understand this. Okay. And you can see we've got vendor reviews, security research, and threat modeling. Okay. And these are all things that you can do without actually touching your environment. You can gather information about your environment. You can see how it's tied, how your environment's tied to other environments, what vendors are involved, who's got accounts, who's doing remote access. You can ask all of these questions without actually touching the environment. So the OT risk is a lot less, all right? The cost to it is it gets a little bit higher as you're starting to do more research and more information gathering, okay? Where the risk gets more involved is when we start actually touching the environment. Whether if we're just coming in and even just doing a walk around, we're exposing people to that environment, so there is additional risk. When we start asking them to collect information from the environment, doing network packet captures, maybe doing some simple mapping, some simple security assessments, there is some risk to the environment. We need to identify that. But definitely as we're doing more complex tasks like penetration testing or even red teaming, that gets really risky because we might not have as much control over those techniques. Now, one of the things that I want to point out, I want to fold this back around to the 62443, okay? When we think about those top three things, the vendor review, the security research, the threat modeling, in order to do that, we have to gather information about our scope. What are we assessing? Who's responsible for things? So we're doing that initial project or that project initiation data gathering, all right? Identifying people, identifying what our resources are, and then we're reviewing, doing a simple review of what we've implemented, what are the vulnerabilities within those assets, okay? That is a high-level risk assessment according to the 62443. So if you're following the 62443 program and as a part of your initial risk assessment steps, you have to do a high-level risk assessment. So gather information and start reviewing this environment. You can identify a lot of vulnerabilities by just doing those three things, asking what the vendor's doing, how you implement it, how have we configured it, and you don't even need to touch the environment, okay? But we do need to understand implementation vulnerabilities, and that's where our security assessments come into play. So we should be doing that after we collect all of this initial information, okay? So we were just talking about cloud. I just added this slide. So, we were just talking about cloud, so I wanted to bring this up. One of the things I try to do as a SANS instructor is try to give back to the community. And it's a part of the time that I devote within a Cutaway Security. And so one of the things, I started thinking about this information gathering, this high level risk assessment. And I was really concerned, and I was concerned about this, for the last year. I was like, how are people going to start these cloud security programs and understand the risk around that if they haven't done that high level risk assessment yet? In other words, gathered the project information, identified the vendors, gathered information from the vendors to understand how they're implementing things. So, I mean, I haven't done this a lot, but I sat down with some of the SANS cloud teams. I've sat down with a few people from some of the OT communities that I'm a part of. And we came up with the high-level risk assessment for cloud products and services. And all this is a PDF. It's a PDF that you can hand to your teams to start. And you identify things like the project lead, who are the vendors that are going to be involved, what cloud services are they providing, okay? Where are you deploying all of these assets? Which regions? Which types of services are they integrating with it? How do your vendors do access management? Okay, questions that normal people that are normally deploying control environments don't necessarily understand, because their job is not cloud implementation and cloud security. So we started this project, and it's a community project. If anybody wants to download it, use it, feel free to do it. It's open source. If you have recommendations on how we can improve it or alter it, just go out to the GitHub. You got the link right there, and submit an issue, and we'll look at it and update it. So that is out there for you. All right. But we want to talk about the vulnerability aspect standpoint. We want to collect information, and we want to identify those implementation risks, and then come up with some recommendations, score those, and then come up with recommendations on how to reduce that risk quickly, and then feed that information back into the risk assessment program. So, yes, I called it tactical ICS security assessments, okay? I'm sorry, Tim, I'm not clever, right? But at the same time, I do think it actually, makes a point, right? Because what we're going to do is, this is the assessment process that I follow when I go in to help teams. This is how I formulate my thought process. How am I going to gather information? What are the steps I'm going to do when I'm actually helping them to identify implementation risks? Okay. First thing I do is I think about physical security. I do that for two reasons. All right. In order to identify physical security risks, you have to do a walkthrough. I'm already doing a walkthrough. One of the first things I need to understand is, what is the process? How is it implemented? I want to interact with the team members, the process engineers and operators. And what better way than do that than to walk through the whole thing and say, what do you do? What is the risk here? What do you think the risk is? Okay. How are you securing things? And then walk through and look at what their perimeter is. Look at their camera configurations. See what the doors look like. One of the issues that I found as I'm walking through and doing these things, new environments are very secure from a physical standpoint, okay? But what happens to a building after 30 years? Does it just stay the same? No. The foundation settles, things rust, buildings move, okay? And that's when we can take advantage, the threat actors can take advantage of those situations, and that's what we're looking for the physical security. But once again, I'm doing two things, two birds with one stone on that. I'm learning about the process, I'm learning about the people, and I'm also checking the physical security. After that, I start looking at their implementation. Now, I've done some of this already because I did that high-level risk assessment. I understand what their deployment is. I've looked at their network configuration, documentation. However, that can be out of date. Gesundheit. Thanks. So I've looked at their documentation. What I want to do with this segmentation and isolation evaluation is what they have documented, actually what's implemented. And that's all I'm looking at. Actually, before I touch anything, I'm actually looking at the configuration visibly. There's a logical implementation, then there's a physical implementation. So I look at it physically. How is everything deployed? Show me all of the systems. Okay, I want to identify as much as possible without touching anything. And so that's the next thing I do. After I start understanding their physical implementation of their networks, I start talking about their access control and authorization. Okay, because you can secure the network through segmentation and isolation. You can have enforcement boundary countermeasures configured correctly, but you have to allow people in. So how are you managing that remote access? And how are you managing that access when they're on site? So we do have to take a look at access control. And then I start looking at the attack surface. The only way to exploit a vulnerability is to be able to send data to it. Okay, so what services are allowing data interactions? So I start doing that. At that point, around that area, that's when I start having to do that active analysis. Now you can do analysis through documentation and so forth. Hopefully they've got the services that they expect to be running documented, but at the same time, we do have to do that validation. So now we need to start looking at the attack surface. You can start with some network stuff. We'll talk about this in a second, but then you do have to do some active reconnaissance. And then from there, I start considering logging and monitoring. I can take all of the information I've collected and start looking at the asset inventory. Remember that the high level risk assessment? A part of that documentation is having an asset list, hardware and software. So when I'm collecting information, I can validate everything that they've documented, and I should be identifying things that have changed over time, okay? I should be identifying things that did get updated or didn't get updated and so forth. And then finally, if we're doing this correctly, and typically there's no way to analyze this outside of talking during a vulnerability assessment, but I do ask questions about incident response and recovery, okay? If you're an information security professional, you should know when you're working in control environments, incident response is important, but also how to recover the process is important as well. So I talk about those things. I don't really test it during a security assessment, but I try to gauge what the operators, what the engineers, what their vision of that is, because they may or may not have had conversations around that, okay? So this is how I'm gonna approach it. All right, but what am I gonna do to organize this effort? I'm going to key in on those specific domains. But here's how I organize it. The first thing we need to do is to scope the assessment. What are we going to be looking at? All right. And this is actually identified very clearly in the 62443 documentation. You should not be doing a security assessment or a risk assessment of a specific environment until you've scoped it appropriately. All right, control environments aren't just a single network or a couple of servers and devices. They are complex systems. If you try to look at everything, I mean, you should look at everything from a holistic standpoint, but if you're doing a risk assessment and vulnerability assessment, you have to drill into specific areas and identify your scope. Okay, so I typically, as a part of my assessment process, do remote scoping. I work with the team, identify what the scope is. We do an architecture review. We collect all of that information, okay? We start looking at that information and do some basic threat modeling, maybe coming up with some use cases about what threat actors might be doing might do to exploit implementation vulnerabilities or actual vulnerabilities. And then we write a test plan, okay? What are we going to test? Now, I could go in there and say, I'm just going to test everything. Okay, I could go in there and follow the normal penetration testing process that we do in our corporate environment, which is the wild, wild west. I'm just going to gather information. I'm going to try to exploit any vulnerability that I can. Okay, if we do that in our control environments, we're going to have a bad day. Okay, because we're going to bring something down or possibly cause catastrophic failure. So in order to make everybody comfortable that we are going to do things in a production environment or even in a testing environment that's not going to damage it and not going to cause a safety issue, we better have a test plan. What are we going to test? When are we going to test it? What tools are we going to use? Okay. You actually need to identify the tools you're going to use beforehand, because sometimes the organization that you're testing, you're not going to be able to use your own systems. They're going to give you those transient cyber assets to test, meaning that you have to create VMs with the appropriate tools to test that environment. So you have to think ahead. Oh, by the way, you didn't realize something was implemented and you need this other tool. You might not be able to use it because you might not have time to approve it to update that TCA. So you better have a test plan going in. Now, when you think about this, first of all, that is your high-level risk assessment. So it feeds directly back into your 62443 process if that's what you're doing. But also, I didn't used to do assessments like this. I was taught by 2 major electrical utilities how to do this. This is our process. This is what we expect you to do. And they converted me because this is a very good model. This is a very good way to test. You know what? This actually adds a week to every assessment. It adds an additional week. But we go in there knowing exactly what we're going to do. The process engineers that we're going in with, they know what we're going to do and they're comfortable with it, or they tell us what they're not comfortable with. Okay. So yes, this adds additional cost. Okay. But if we plan for it, if we know that up front, you know, it's the benefit of this is invaluable. Okay. After that, once we get on site, that's when I start doing all of those other things. And you've heard me talk about a little bit. I do that site walkthrough. But while I'm doing that, I start doing my interviews. All right. I do my interviews with the engineers, operators. Okay. Some of those people aren't going to be there for the walkthrough, so I have to schedule time with them. I start talking, if I need to talk to programmers, sometimes I do, sometimes I don't. It really depends on our test plan. Everything I'm doing is typically I have a liaison, somebody that's right there from their IT security team with me. But if there's an OT or an IT administration team, hopefully that we've gotten them, we should be scheduling time with them as well, finding out where they get some of their gold disk images. How do they manage the databases? How do they manage the web services? How do they do updates and so forth? Okay, so we want those team members. If they're not there, we need to schedule time with them, and that's a part of our test plan. Okay, and then sometimes I talk to managers as well, because we need to understand their expectations of how things should be. Okay. From there, I start gathering information. I need to gather information about those, network segmentation and isolation, also gather information about asset management and attack surface. So I do that, I try to do that through network capture analysis, okay? Oh, actually, you know what? I got another slide for this. Ah, yes, I did. Yeah, so here's that high-level risk assessment, okay? I consider what we just talked about passive, okay? And actually 62443 talks about passive and active analysis. So this would be your passive analysis, those steps. We could actually stop at our assessment right here if we really wanted to. We probably have enough information about gaps in the implementation of a process environment to address things. But sometimes we need to validate our assumptions. Sometimes we need to identify some of those implementation issues that aren't found verbally, okay? So we do need to do some active assessment. And these are our active assessment steps, okay? Now, in our corporate environments, we typically think of network traffic capture and analysis passive, meaning we just get a span port, we just put a network tap in, okay? But when we put a network tap in or we create a span port, what are we actually doing to the environment? We're creating a change. Right? We're changing the configuration of a switch or a network device. We're actually disconnecting a cable and plugging our network tap in. That can have a negative impact on the process environment. That can cause something to go down. So you shouldn't be doing this without permission, without monitoring and stuff like that. All right. So network capture and analysis is an active step. And then we do our attack surface enumeration, following some very specific methods for capturing that information, gathering data, interacting with our network services, okay, and collecting that data. And then all of this information, at the same time, we're going to be reviewing our asset management. And a part of our network scanning is going to help us identify some of those all of those systems that are online that aren't necessarily communicating, okay? Then we need to take all of this information and do reporting, okay? And this is probably the most important part, and this is what I learned from the very beginning, meaning that we can do all of this testing, but if we don't know how to write about this correctly in a way that people understand it, then none of this effort is worth it. So you do need to train people on how to correctly write reports and then interact with and communicate that information to the organization. Okay, so this is how I conduct my assessments. This is how we're This is one of the ways that we're managing how we're going to be teaching the ICS 613 with my input and with the input from the other instructors as well. Okay. Did I say anything about pen testing? Is there anything in here about exploitation? I just said we're gathering information. Okay. It doesn't mean I won't do an exploit within your environment. Okay. The only time I've ever done that, I work with the one utility that actually has testing environments implemented. I mean, most of the utilities that I have, they have testing environments, but this one utility is just like, yeah, go after it. You pen test our test environment. We want to know what you can exploit. Okay. Everywhere else that I've been in, I have never honed a box. Okay. I do security assessments in these environments. Now, it doesn't mean I'm not able to exploit a vulnerability, and I get to the point that I can, but then I look at my liaison, I'm like, do you want me to exploit this? Hey, process engineer, do you feel comfortable with me potentially taking down this server, this system? No, I don't. All right, are you good to know that I could probably do that? Yes, I am. Usually that's all it takes. But at times we might actually do exploitation. Okay, so cyber assessment reports. Now the traditional reports, so if you do training, if you start doing a penetration testing training here, even here at SANS, the outline that they typically follow and they typically tell you to write an effective report is there on the left. Traditional assessment reports. We have an executive summary. We outline the scope of what we're doing. We have a detailed methodology, which is actually an activity log. So every time you run a scan with something, with some tool, you're getting a screenshot or of that information and you're putting in there. I did this thing. I got this information. That led me to this. I ran this tool. It gave me this information. So a detailed activity log and methodology outline, very detailed. And I love writing those because first of all, it shows the logical process of how we got through things. So it shows off some of my skill set, but it also shows IT administrators, technically OT administrators as well. It shows leadership, okay, what people were thinking and how they got to the logical conclusion and how they ended up achieving the goals, okay? There's a lot of detail in there and that actually takes a lot of time. From there, I take all of that information, I look at it and I start thinking about the vulnerabilities that were taken advantage of or the implementation vulnerabilities that I've seen from that information. And from there, I write findings that have observation, risks, and recommendations. We do score that. We come up with some high, medium, low kind of scoring system to evaluate that. Then we write a summary and a conclusion. We provide supporting data. That's a lot of effort and a lot of detail. Okay. But what my major utility said is like, we don't need that methodology. Okay. We know why you're here. We actually sat down and we watched you do all of this. All we really care about is your activity log. All right. Why are we concerned about your activity log? I want to know if what you did made a change to the system. Okay. Did you create a new user account? I want you to note that. I want you to tell me if you cleaned that up, if you deleted that, or if you didn't delete it. I don't care what the reason was for. Maybe you didn't delete it because you lost that session. Okay. Or you didn't have the permissions. We changed the permissions on you and you couldn't delete it. But I need to know somebody needs to go and clean that up. Okay. Did you run a tool and it created a file on that system? We were approved to put that file on that system, but were you able to remove it? They don't want to find it a year later. They want to clean it up now. So that's the focus of the activity log. What's the list of things that you did? And did you have an impact on the system? And did you change it back to the way it was supposed to be? Okay, so activity logs. And then a list of findings. The findings have the observations, the risks as we see them, and then the consequences as the team sees them. And finally, the recommendation. Consequences. If we took advantage of that vulnerability, what does that mean we have? How are we affecting monitoring? How are we affecting control? Okay, so we write that up. And if you think about that, I just used terms from the MITRE ICS attack matrix. And if you look at the last impact field, I actually go down and I look at the impact field in the MITRE attack matrix. I didn't put it in the slide, but this is actually what I do. I look at loss of control, loss of view, okay? I use all of those impacts and I use that in my consequence write-up, okay? Now, I do it from my view and from the security team that I'm integrating with. I ask them, do you agree with this? Okay, and then we look at the operators and we ask them if they agree with this. And we write it up from their point of view when we can. If not, if I don't have that interaction with the operators, with the engineers, I write it up as I see it. And as I'm handing it off, I'm like, hey, you need to have the team relook at these consequences because I might not be right, okay? And then we come up with recommendations to remediate. And that's what we provide. And they feed this, they do some tactical risk analysis. What do we need to change right now? But then they also feed this into their risk assessment process from my experience with the utilities. All right, so how do we score these things? I've got to kind of cut off there. So how do we score these things? Well, oh, mine's cut off. You're good. So when you look at the 62443 documentation and you look at their scoring, how do we score vulnerabilities? Their recommendation is that you use the scoring system that you use for your risk assessment process. And they provide you some recommendations. Here's how it's traditionally done. Okay, traditionally it's done like, will this vulnerability be exploited? Will this issue come up and be exploited once a year, once every 5 years, once every 10 years? In other words, they haven't come up with a good scoring system for vulnerabilities yet. And they identify that the industry does not have a good scoring system. And I'm sure they're working on it right now. This is a hard process because for an international standard, you have to have a large number of people agree to everything. And so it's hard to get that. So I understand why they're doing it. But when we look to all of the NIST documentation, when we look at the NIST 830, which outlines how to score vulnerabilities, okay, it still talks about the consequences associated with the likelihood and events in years, okay? Well, how long is it going to take for somebody to exploit our systems and our control environment? Is it going to be this year or next year? Pick one, all right? So this is a problem, and this is something that I've been troubled with, right? And I've been asking people, like, how do we score these systems? And actually my utilities, one utility, so I'm working with those two utilities. The first one tells me score everything associated with NIST 830. So I look in there and I just kind of extrapolate and I figure out the best scores that I can, and I get the best vulnerability scores out of that. My other utility, they tell me to use the OWASP risk analysis system. Okay, so if you go out, you can go out to the OWASP website. You can look up their risk assessment process. You can actually go out and find there's a OWASP calculator to do a vulnerability scoring. Okay, now that is kind of it's based on any vulnerabilities, but it's typically geared towards web and mobile application assessments. Okay, it does have information, but the problem with both of those solutions is it talks about business risk. How much is this going to cost? Okay, how much does this affect our reputation? Now, all of those things are important with our control environments, but the things that people in our control environments are most concerned about, those process engineers, those operators, they're concerned about safety. Okay, they are concerned about what is the impact to safety, environmental damage, process damage. How is it affecting the safety equipment? How does this affect my recoverability? Okay, so what I did is I just took the OWASP system. Okay, I reached out to see if, you know, if they wanted some help or if they could help me. They didn't respond. That's fine. They're, you know, people are busy, but why wait for them to respond? So I just took their process. I rewrote it with some of the information that I have. I've had some people in the industry help me with some of the verbiage around the methodology for how I got to this system. And then I went through and I thought about how can we measure the threat actor factors, the vulnerability factors, the technical impact, and the safety impact factors associated with control environments. Okay, what I was concerned about is how can I word things so that when we're selecting the risk score for each of one of these factors, how can I get a process engineer to read that and say, oh, okay, we don't have multi-factor authentication in this area. The score has to be this. Oh, we do have multi-factor authentication, so this is the score. Okay. And so I took that terminology and I updated a little bit. I've had a few people look at it. I'm hoping more people will look at it so I can update the verbiage. Actually, really what I want from this is I want people from different industries to look at this. And we create an industry specific version for each one of these, one for electrical, one for gas and oil, obviously one that's kind of generic, okay? Maybe one for maritime, because all of these factors are going to be slightly different for every industry within control environments. But I've got to start somewhere. If I wait for it to be perfect, we're going to be waiting forever. We still haven't done this. So this is actually up online. I kind of finalized the methodology write-up so that people can understand what the approach is. But then I also came up with a calculator, okay? Just like the OWASP calculator. So you can go out to the AICS star-calculator.com and you can start using this vulnerability assessment calculator. Tim actually helped me with this. I actually was calling this the risk assessment calculator, like OWASP did. And Tim was like, no, it's not. But as soon as he said that, I had already realized that I'm not doing risk assessments. I'm doing vulnerability assessments. So we came up with STAR, System Testing and Assessment Rating Score Calculator. So ICS STAR, because this is doing a vulnerability assessment. Now, can the risk assessment use this to score stuff? Yes, it could, okay? But right now, I want to start tactically. I want to start talking about vulnerabilities, and then that will feed into the risk assessment process, okay? So I came up with this the last time I got, you know, I've given a type of this talk before, okay? And when I got to this point, one of the things I was thinking about is I go into organizations and I assess one, so I get a scope and I do an assessment for one portion of their organization. And then I get my next scope and I go into that other team and I do an assessment in another area. And then I do another assessment. In other words, I do multiple assessments for these large and industrial clients of mine, okay? But what happens is, what I realized is that every time I go into one of these sites, I'm doing assessments and I'm finding the same type of vulnerabilities. Now, when I do my write-ups, I actually write up my vulnerabilities and I talk about systematic vulnerabilities, meaning what are the vulnerabilities that the organization should be addressing to help those process engineers and those operators. You know, it takes a long time for those things to get applied from an organization level. But what I'm seeing is at the tactical level, we're not getting those same physical vulnerabilities addressed, those same segmentation vulnerabilities addressed. Why am I getting the same finding from the same organization in different business units? Well, that's because they're not sharing the information, okay? Why aren't organizations taking a security assessment and improving the cost impact of it? Meaning that why don't you just take the assessment that I give you, take that vulnerability report and distribute that to all of your process engineers, leaders, okay, all of your teams, okay? Do all of the vulnerabilities apply to them? Probably not, but do some of them? Absolutely. And if they can address those vulnerabilities before I get there, guess what? I can concentrate on other things, okay? And also at the same time, they're reducing vulnerabilities. So what I'm saying with this slide is you should be distributing these vulnerability reports to all of your business units, And your business units, the team leads there should be looking at it and saying, that doesn't apply. That doesn't apply. Hey, have we looked at this? Or do we have all of the feeds from our CCTV cameras? Do we have cameras that are down? Oh yeah, we haven't replaced that camera and it's been down for 2 years. Well, that's a risk, right? So they can use these reports. You don't have to keep paying me to evaluate every single environment and identifying the same vulnerabilities, okay? Now, depending on your organization, depending on where you're giving these things to, you might have to sanitize some of those reports. So maybe your team needs to do a little work to sanitize that information to distribute it. It's not that hard, okay? So that would be my recommendation is sharing some of these assessment reports. Now, in some industries, we have different industries. You can see there I have different ISACs, so the information sharing groups. I talked about munis and co-ops. That's one of my recommendations is if you're a co-op, if you're a muni, or even if you're an ISAC, why aren't you taking some of your security assessments, come up with a way to sanitize this information and give it to your group? Hey, guess what? We don't have a lot of money to do a security assessment. Oh, well, here's our last report. It's sanitized. Do you have these vulnerabilities? Oh yeah, we should probably do that, right? And they've got some of the recommendations in there. So my recommendation is we start distributing some of this stuff. Now, does that mean it's less work for me? Absolutely. Does it mean my grid's more secure? 100%. I want the world to be a more secure place, right? So we should be sharing some of this information where we can. All right. So coming back around to 62443 risk assessments. Should we be looking at all of these foundational requirements for every single system for the scope of our environments? Yes, we should be doing that from a risk assessment standpoint. This is a strategic process. This is how you address systemic issues within your organization, okay? But if we want to protect a process right now, if we try to do this, this is going to take us forever. Guess what? All of the information that I collected from the vulnerability assessment tells you how well you're doing in all 7 of those domains. And you can use that information to help you understand your security levels that you're achieving for every one of those areas. But that's your risk assessment process. That's not your vulnerability assessment process. So my recommendations are here. You can read those. We need to do vulnerability assessments tactically to help our, getting me out to your organization, getting people like me that are experienced in doing assessment at the process level, okay? Getting in front of your team helps them understand what the threat actors are doing. I tap my head because I'm thinking about the evil bit. A lot of people don't have the evil bit, but when they start talking to people with the evil bit, then they start going, oh yeah, well, you can't do that, but you can do this, because they know their processes, right? So get people out there doing security assessments at the process level, okay? But we want to quickly identify those gaps because they're going to be looking at you and saying, okay, how do we protect this? What do we need to do right now? I know this is going up, but what configuration do I change right now to improve my process, to protect my process, okay? We should be doing the 62443 detailed risk assessment. If you're preparing for a security assessment, that's the scoping process. So gather that information, push it up to your risk assessment team, okay? And then distribute a lot of this information. Find out a way that you can distribute this within your organization so you're not paying for this over and over and over, because if you're just doing it over and over and over and if you're not sharing this information, you're going to find the same vulnerabilities over and over again. Why pay for the same thing twice? Okay. So I'm Don Weber. I teach the ICS 410 class. If you're here in person, I'm here all week. So if you have any questions for me, I'm happy to answer those questions. I'll be here this evening as well. Tim, are there any questions from the Slack team? Are there, so the question, So he's coming up with the questions from Slack. So are there any questions here from in-person people? All right, I covered it all. There we go. I'm perfect.
You're first. So this is from the earlier panel. If you could talk about any assessments you performed that involve cloud-based solutions. So as a part of your process where you're looking at what they're doing and there are cloud integrated applications, or
did the panel members leave?
They're in the hallway.
Dang it. Well, I mean, one of the questions that I wanted to ask and what we've been looking at from a utility standpoint, and what we're going to see a lot more of from a cloud standpoint is, yes, we have organizations that are implementing the cloud. Your vendors are going to be providing those solutions, and we're going to have to assess those as they're going forward. The cloud solutions that I've had the opportunity to look at are more utility based right now, but they're not necessarily as far as managing the actual grid within the organization. I've been looking at the information that they're going to be collecting from other resources. In other words, they have the distributed energy resource management system, so DERMS, which is collecting the information from things like solar generation and electrical vehicles, and there are going to be gateway organizations that are going to be cloud-based services that people are going to sign up with to send information, usage information, and possibly generation information back to a specific utility. And some of that integration and I'm trying to think of the word associated with provisioning. Some of that's going to be automatic provisioning associated with the utilities account, those users' accounts through a gateway, and those communications. And there's also got to be some certificate generation that's coming from the utility as well. So I've had the opportunity to look at that. The organization that I'm doing is holding the vendors very accountable for their implementation, requiring them to use the actual utilities certificate authority, which has been a challenge for them, but they're getting through that. So I've had the opportunity to evaluate that, and the rapid deployment of all of those technologies, the push to green generation and electrical vehicles and so forth is just going to, we're going to see rapid deployment of some of those technologies. So I've been able to do that. Does that answer the question though?
It does. I'm good with it. Next one.
Okay.
And this will be quick. In regards to your test plan, they were looking and wondering how granular is the test plan, meaning does it go into very specific tests that will be run down to the keystroke? Do you break out of test cases based on findings or what you're doing? They're looking for more detail on your test plan that's established before you enter.
And yes, that's definitely understand that concern around there. So the test plan is usually more of a generic. What are those use cases that we are going to test? In other words, we're coming up with, we're going to prioritize the identification of implementation vulnerabilities to see if they are actually exploitable. In other words, we can look at something and say, I think we can take advantage of this, but the test plan is going to say, we're going to take a look at that. It does not include down to the keystroke because, actually, looking at something from a design standpoint and looking at that documentation is going to be different than an implementation standpoint. But our test plan is going to be like, okay, I think we're going to use these tools, or we need to have these tools available to us so that we can identify that solution. We do need to, because we might be downloading some of those tools to our transient cyber assets, some of those tools do need to be evaluated and approved to be deployed within these environments. So the test plan is detailed in that aspect, but definitely not down to the keystroke. And most of the organizations that I do, and it really depends on their how comfortable they are with the team that is testing. But usually the utilities that I'm working with, that their team are doing things and they're comfortable with me doing things, we prioritize those test plans first, because sometimes it can take up our whole time. But then also they know that we are, from a penetration standpoint, we're going to see things and we're going to pull on that thread. And they allow me to pull on that thread, which means we can't do it down to the keystroke level. Does that answer the question?
Sure does. The final question will be a speculative one. I responded to a number of others that are out there. You can review my responses and decide whether they're appropriate. But there was a question in regards to other industries like PCI, where they have PCI ASV, so approved scanning vendors. do you envision we're gonna get to some type of qualified, credentialed, approved vendors from an ICS OT space at some point in time? Speculative.
I don't really operate at that level. People ignore me in the industry is at that level. I would hope that we don't, meaning that I think it's difficult to validate some of those people. I do think some of the concerns around certifications and people saying that they are experts and that professionals are valid. Meaning that some of the people that are looking at that sort of certification and looking at those words are just going to assume that people know how to test these environments and can do it. It means that those certifications means that they've been exposed to the techniques and the terminologies, but implementation is proven through experience. And so people should be vetting the experience. As far as certification around that, that's just going to increase the cost to everything. And I think it's going to make it more difficult to select some of those people that are experienced, meaning that there's going to be small organizations like me that can't afford to get that certification, large organizations that are going to get the certification and then just start throwing interns and inexperienced people in there. So I hope not, but the 62443, there is ISA Secure, which is validating and having a process to validate secure implementations. So I do see efforts associated with certifying people that can go in and validate the 62443 or the ISA Secure certified solutions to identify whether or not those are implemented the way that the certification outlines. So I do see certification around that. Does that answer the question?
It sure does.
Okay.
I'd like to thank Don for his talk. Oh,
yes, go ahead.
Wait. There's a question in the room. Yes.
So can you share me about your experience or thoughts about any type of assessments on networks that shied away from the Purdue model, such as like connecting to a corporate network with or without a physical firewall?
So I've been fortunate that the organizations that I've gone into, they've understood that their most critical network as far as their business is their control environment, meaning that they've identified that risk. They want to protect that environment from the corporate environment. As far as whether or not they've implemented leveraging the Purdue model, that is just a reference architecture. That is the way that you design the networks, and it's a model for how to understand the roles of different devices and services within that area. So I don't see them specifically shying away from it, but they've utilized that as far as the implementation. But as I mentioned, I've been fortunate enough to look at organizations that have had that separation between the control environments and the corporate environments. Does that answer your question?
A solid sure.
Yeah.
All right. Please join me in thanking Don for his talk.